All right, good afternoon. We are this week talking about control theory, and we have a few different examples to talk about this week, right? And let me list those, and then we'll kind of get in further into the video where I'll describe each of those in detail. We're going to talk a little bit about the beginning of control theory and this is gonna talk a little bit about Emil Durkheim and his ideas about how relationships and control our behavior, and it's kind of typical of the way most sociologists think about social control. And then we'll talk about Travis Hershey's social bond theory, right? And then we'll talk about Sampson and Lobb's age-graded informal social control theory. And then we'll talk about a different theory that also involves Travis Hershey, but it's different than social bond theory. And I want to point this out so you don't get confused, right? The self-control theory, the second theory that Travis Hershey created, and he also had a co-author, Michael Gottfredson. It is a theory that comes later in Travis Hershey's life and career, and it is completely different. In fact, he says that we shouldn't try to combine his two theories, social bond theory and self-control theory. That's unusual. Usually, if someone has a theory, like their next theory will kind of build upon it and improve it and expand it and stuff. But that's what Travis Hershey says. We shouldn't try to integrate those two theories, and I'll teach them as if they're so completely separate. I just want to point out that's kind of weird. Not the opinion of most social theorists, right? All right, so try not to get those confused. There's the early social bond theory, and then there's a later Hershey and Gottfredson's self-control theory, right? Those two theories in the middle, we'll talk about Sampson Lobb's age-graded informal social control theory. All right, so if you're looking at the PowerPoint, and I suggest you do kind of follow along in this, right? I have a picture of a very young Bob Dylan, and I don't know if you're a fan, probably not. But growing up, I was, right? And although certainly not of my time, probably my dad's more. But there's a lyric in one of his lines, and it exemplifies control theory. When you got nothing to lose, right? People who don't have things, right, or sometimes this is called like states in conformity. They're free to do whatever they want to do. They have nothing to lose. Those of us who do have things, right? And even those of us that have more things, more relationships, right? Jobs, marriages, relationships with kids, right? Neighbors and stuff like that. Oh, we have a lot to lose, right? And in that instinct, and because we have more to lose, generally speaking, we behave ourselves much more, right? And that's something that kind of Durkheim noticed, over 100 years ago in France, right? That married people far less likely to engage in crime, far less likely to commit suicide, right? Suicide was one of the things that he studied first, right? So married people, people who had relationships with lots of their neighbors versus people that isolate and don't have very many friends. What else? People that go to church and attend regularly, right? People who have jobs generally behave better than people that don't have a job. Durkheim noticed these patterns a long time ago, and they still hold true in our society. Now, that doesn't mean that, there won't be an unemployed or married person that might go on a crime spree, but generally speaking, like general patterns in society, the more relationships you have, the more you're kind of plugged into society, the less likely you will. That's the fundamental insight, right? And another way of putting this is relationships matter. And how do they matter? They control us. They prevent us from doing selfish things, right? Impulsive things. They, prevent me. I'll give you an example, right? There are times, right, where I could go to a store, right? And if I wanted to, I could steal something. And you know what? I don't like paying for things, right? I'd rather get them for free, right? But I don't do that, right? Maybe when I was young, right? My fingers were a little bit stickier. But nowadays, like the chances of that are, I can't imagine, right? But if I do imagine, right? And maybe I got caught, right? Or maybe I didn't get caught, right? And I came home and I had some nice new shiny object. My wife's like, "Where'd you get that from?" I was like, I stole that today." I mean, my wife's gonna look at me in horror like, "What the? What do you mean you stole it, right? You idiot, right?" If you get arrested, for doing something stupid like that, you're going to embarrass the whole family. You might lose your job, right? What are the neighbors going to think? And not only of you, but of me, your wife, and the kids. And we're all going to be embarrassed and stuff like that. And you know what? Those are the things that I have to lose by engaging in, crime. They're not arrest, right? So what keeps me in line, right, and makes me obey the law are not the police, are not arrests, are not jail sentences, are not the opinions of law enforcement officers. It's not I'll be embarrassed in front of the judge, because really, I might be embarrassed if people find out about it, but I don't know the judge. I don't care about the judge, right? His opinions of me, right? Those are, what my wife, my neighbors, my employers, and colleagues and stuff, those are informal bonds, right? And when we get to Samson Law, we talk about age-graded informal social bonds. That'll make more sense, right? And that's kind of, sociologists have always kind of thought those informal bonds mattered more for controlling people than the formal bonds. Formal bonds are law enforcement, judges, probation officers, police officers, parole officers, correctional officers, and stuff like that. Now, I wouldn't like to get arrested. I wouldn't, but I don't do those things. Really, I don't, I could probably get away with it and never get arrested, right? But I still don't do that. And I gave the example of like telling my wife and seeing the look of horror in her eyes and stuff. But even if I tried to keep it a secret, right, I would know about it, and I would probably feel ashamed, right? And I might even think like, my mom and dad didn't raise me to be like this, right? And so that, like, society gets it recruits us into controlling our own behavior, right? Which is really important, right? We internalize social control, and we do a lot of things. Even if I was alone, no one ever found out about it. I still wouldn't steal because I would know about it, and I would have a guilty conscience, and that's internal control. All right. that's kind of the basics of how sociologists view social control, and society's always trying to control us. Other people are always trying to control us, right? We're never completely free, but at the same time, the control is not absolute, right? Um, uh, there have been times in my life when I was a young teenager, maybe I did steal a piece of candy or something like that, right? Um, yeah. And so it's never absolute. It's possible, right? That I could shoplift something tomorrow, right? I mean, when I was younger, I was rebellious and do dumb stuff like this, right? I'm not as rebellious as I used to be. Maybe a little bit. My wife would probably tell you I still am a little rebellious, right? But that's kind of the basic. That's kind of how control theorists like Emil Durkheim, some other people like Kornhauser, and earlier people thought about social control, right? And how it makes us conform and it reduces crime, right? Gets us out of trouble and stuff like that, right? Yeah, and so this is kind of the origins of control theory, right? And yeah, deviance will arise in the absence of restraints or controls against it, right? So who were the kids that were juvenile delinquents when you were growing up? Did they have good loving fathers and mothers that were heavily involved in their lives? Or are they kind of left to their own devices, right? Yeah. Now, yeah. Let's move on. Here's where we get into Travis Hershey's first theory, social bond theory, right? This theory he developed and tested with high school students. So he would go into high schools. They would agree to this, and principals would allow him in, and him and his graduate students would hand out surveys to people, and it would ask them a lot of questions about their social bonds and elements of the social bond, which we'll get to. But it also asked them if they shoplifted, if they got in fistfights, if they drank beer underage, if they smoked cigarettes, like minor acts of juvenile delinquency. So that's kind of that is the dependent variable. It's not kind of, it is the dependent variable. You take all those acts of juvenile delinquency, you just sum them up. Bigger number means more delinquent, right? Smaller number is less delinquent. Zero, no delinquency, right? And he thought that the social bonds could predict those things. And this is his theory, and this is his hypothesis, and he found evidence for it, right? And there are four elements to the social bond according to Travis Hershey, right? And, when I made this PowerPoint, I gave each one their own slide. So you see, slide 7, attachment, commitment, involvement, and belief. And I'm going to talk real briefly about these, right? Because you are, of course, reading the textbook, and you'll learn more when you do that, right? And I don't want this video to go on forever, right? And you don't either, right? All right, so attachment, the first one, right? And maybe the most important one, right? Norms are the expectations that other people have. We have norms and expectations ourselves, but other people do. That's why I always talk about norms as expectations, not rules for behavior. No, expectations are always held by people, right? And and typically people want to live up to those expectations, right? If they don't, it can damage their relationships, right? So the attachments that really matter for kids when they're in high school are this: attachments to their parents and attachments to teachers and principals, authority figures at school, right? If you ask someone, this is what Travis Hershey, do you love and respect your parents? Do you admire your teachers, right? The people that say, oh yes, certainly I do, they're not the ones that engage in lots of juvenile delinquency, right? In fact, it's just the opposite. It's the ones that like, I don't like my parents, I don't respect them, I hate my teacher and stuff like. Those are the ones, right? So this is the first element in the social bond, attachment, right? And it's really important, right? And it's basically like, do you care about other people, right? And do you care about your parents, and do you care about teachers, and do you want them to like you or approve of you, right? And we internalize these norms, most of us, not all of us, and because of this, people that measure high on attachment are very unlikely to engage in delinquent behavior. This is, I would point out, like a theory of juvenile delinquency, right? And and that makes sense because he's testing it all with high school kids, right? The next element, the second of the four elements that Travis Hershey talked about, was involvement, right? And this is, as Hershey said, the assumption widely shared is that a person may be simply too busy doing conventional things to find time to engage in delinquent behavior, right? And your parents might have told you this, like the idleness is the devil's workshop, right? There's something to be said, and a lot of parents do this, is like your kid goes to school, they get out of school, they go to soccer, and then they go to piano, and next thing you know, like they're exhausted and they go straight to their bed and they go to sleep, right? And I might be exaggerating a little bit, but if you keep kids busy and they're always being supervised by adults, right? Good pro-social adults, then they generally just won't engage in much juvenile delinquency, right? It's when they're unsupervised, right? It's when they're unsupervised. When they kind of, like, some parents just let their kids roam the street, they don't know where they are, come home anytime that you want to, right? Those are the kids that are much more likely to be involved in juvenile delinquency, and they're also hanging out with all the other neighborhood kids that their parents let them do that as well, right? That's involvement. The way he measured that is he asked them how many extracurricular activities are you involved in. Band, football, chess club, piano lessons, soccer, all that kind of stuff. And the higher number, the higher your involvement is, right? The next thing is belief, right? This is the third of the four elements of the social bond, right? And this is the idea that you believe in the fairness, the justice, the morality of this system, right? Of our society, right? Do you believe that the world is fair? Do you believe that the law applies equally to people, right? And you can imagine the whole high school kids, perhaps even your high school, being asked this question, right? And the kind of goody two-shoes kids, oh yeah, everything's fair, and and then on the opposite end is like, nothing's fair, the police aren't fair, the law's not fair, right? Those are the ones that are going to engage in more juvenile delinquency, right? And he actually asked some questions like, do you respect police officers? And another one, do you believe that the law is applied equally to different people in society, right? That's belief, right? So and I hope you can see, if you tend to, most people, if they score high on attachment, they respect their teachers and their parents and stuff like that, then they'll also probably be in lots of extracurricular activities. So, you know what? I skipped one. I'm sorry about that. I skipped commitment, right? which is actually pretty easy, right? Commitment is the amount of effort, time that you invest in conformity. And the way that he measured is he went in their files at the school and he measured their GPA, right? I'm going to stop this for just a second and close this door, okay? All right. I was talking about commitment and how I had skipped that. Sorry. I skipped the second one, right? And I think I kind of got confused in my numbering of these things. There's attachment, commitment, involvement, and belief, right? So, and I already said that commitment gets measured by going in their academic files and looking up their GPA, right? And if your high school was like mine, is like anyone else's, the kids that made 4.0s or 3.5s and above, right, generally were not the juvenile delinquents, right? Yeah. Yeah. So that's, that's Travis Hershey's social bond theory, right? And I also have a quote from Hershey here at the very end. I'll read it and I'll kind of summarize that theory. In the end, then, control theory remains what it has always been, a theory in which deviation is not problematic, right? The question, why do they do it, is simply not the question the theory is designed to answer. The question is, why don't we do it? There's much evidence that we would if we dared, right? Now, this is something that's very different than differential association, right? It assumes that people are born into this world and they will do things, right, that benefit them individually, right? Like differential association kind of sees us as like socially compliant, conformist. Then we meet some delinquent delinquent peers, and they corrupt us, right? That was differential association. Social control theories assume the opposite, right? That we're kind of all born bad, and we would commit crime and assault people and stuff like that. But society, right, prevents us from doing that. It's society civilizes us, right? You remember our very first reading where we talked about assumptions of man, right? These two theories make different assumptions, right? That's really important. All right, I'm going to move on, right, to the next one. And that's Sampson and Lobb's age graded pearl. Sorry, I'm going to stop this because I got someone coming to the door. All right, sorry about that. So I'm talking about Sampson and Lobb's age graded informal social control theory, right? I'm going to try to keep this brief, right? It's going to be hard for me to do because I'm more familiar with this theory than any other theory that we'll discuss. It's the theory that I tested for my dissertation. I've published in this area and stuff like that. So it's kind of my favorite, right? I know it's not everyone else's favorite, but here's how it goes, right? The first thing you need to know about Sampson and Lobb is like, they're not just interested in people at one age, right? Hershey was, right? He was interested in high school students. He's interested in criminal and delinquent behavior across the entire life course, right? And it is true that some people commit crimes when they're young and they go on to commit an entire lifetime of crime at a very high rate, right? But not all people, not all criminals even, right? Some people, a lot of people commit acts during their juvenile years, but, they stop by the time they get to college, and by the time they're 25, 30, they have desisted. They have stopped, right? I don't know if you ever heard of a cease and desist letter, but desist means you stop, right? And he's interested in occasionally people commit no crime when they're really young, but for some reason, when they're 30 or 40, they will begin a life of crime, right? That's kind of three different patterns, right? And like, why does that happen, right? Well, we're talking about control theory, and you might guess, relationships. That's why it happens, right? And when they explain juvenile delinquency, less than 18 years old, they're like, pretty much exactly what Travis said, right? But then when you get later, like, once you're out of high school, your relationships to your parents don't matter as much. And your relationships to your teachers don't matter at all, right? And this is why it's called age-graded informal social control, right? It is about informal bonds, right? So it's not about, police officers and judges and stuff like that. It's informal bonds, right? But the relationships that control us change across the life course, right? Even during college, right? A lot of people engage in some crime during college, right? Lots of people, unless college has changed drastically. And I don't think it has, because occasionally I smell my students when they walk in the classroom and they reek of marijuana, right? And that's college students do this, right? I'm not shocked or outraged by it or anything, right? This is how it was when I was in Alabama in the early 90s, right? Even before my time, college students often smoke marijuana, right? Some, perhaps most college students will grow out of that. And here's why they grow out of it, right? They graduate, they get a job, they meet a girl, they marry that girl, they stop hanging out with their college buddies, and they stay home, right? And that all produces desistance. And you see how that is not their relationship to their parents, and it's not their relationship to their teacher. The informal relationships are different. That's the age-graded part of this, right? And so one of the things that they found that was really interesting is like people can have trajectories, right? You can commit a lot of crime when you're young, right? And it looks like, once a criminal, always a criminal. And all hope is lost, right? And sometimes we put these people in prison and kept them there for the rest of your lives, right? Samson Lobbs say that's a big mistake, right? Because even those people can turn their lives around, right? And when they do this, this is what they call a turning point. When they experience a transition, like they get a good job, right? It has to be a good job. When they get when they marry, and it's a good marriage, right? These are transitions that have the potential, right, to be turning points. Now, some people will get a job, and some people will get married, and it will not change their daily behavior. They will still go to the bar, they will still hang out with their friends, and still, do illicit substances or hang out in the street corner or something like that. But for a lot of people, when they get married, and the marriage is a good marriage, right? They stop. And it might not be overnight, right? They might, the spouse might have to persuade them, particularly early on that, you need to come home. You need to spend time with the kids, and you don't need to be out at all times during the week because you got to go to work tomorrow. If you lose your job, you're going to lose me as a spouse, right? That's age-graded informal social control theory, right? It's just the relationships are controlling us, right? It also combines this life course perspective, right? How we kind of look at people over an entire period of time. It also requires a different type of data, right? So, like when I talked about Travis Hershey going into high schools, he's handing out surveys, he's asking them about their delinquency at one point in their life. You can't test Sampson and Lobb's theory with that type of data, right? Instead, what you have to do is you have to find people at a very early age and ask them questions about their delinquent and criminal behavior, and then come back in 1 year. And then come back in 1 year and ask the exact same people, right? You need to measure what they call change in stability, right? That's much more difficult to do as a researcher. It's much more expensive to do, to find those same people every year. It might not be that hard the first year or the second year, but you know, if you collect people across their entire life course, right, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, it becomes really difficult, becomes really expensive. And you also have problems that, you know, some of the people end up in prison, some of them die, some of them move to other countries and stuff like that. Much more difficult to do. That's, you know, longitudinal study where you track people over a very long period of time, right? But it's what's required if you want to look at change in stability across time, right? The important turning points. So what they had a sample of kids that were all in juvenile homes, like boys' homes, particularly in Boston, right? All boys, all significant juvenile delinquency. So significant they're moved from their families and they're put in like a reformatory school, right? Like in the 1930s, a long time ago, right? And as they followed these people, even the worst, like even kids that were serious juvenile delinquent, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes when they got married, when they got a job, and also when they joined the military, those things straightened them up and they desisted, they stopped committing crime, right? So those are the important turning points. Now, a lot of research, including my own, has supported this, like found the same thing, except for the military, right? Which is kind of interesting, but there's ways of explaining that, right? All the kids at Sampson and Lobb, when they joined the military, it was during World War II, and that's a war that had a beginning and had an end. There was a clear winner of that war. And when the soldiers came back, they were celebrated with parades and they were viewed as heroes, right? And that is not similar to most wars that we've had since. It is certainly not similar to the Vietnam War, right? And in fact, when people research Vietnam veterans, they don't find that that's a turning point, right? Probably something unique to the World War II experience that caused that to be a turning point. All right. I think that's all I'm going to say about that, right? You can look over these PowerPoints and kind of learn some of the details about that. There are some problems with their research. I mean, the biggest problem is they were all males. They were all white. They were all from the Boston era. You know, in fact, my own dissertation tested the same ideas, but a more diverse population with whites and blacks and Hispanics, with men and women, right? And I won't bore you with all those details, but things get complicated, I'll say that. Here's the last theory that I'm going to talk about, and it's Travis Hershey's second theory, right? And he has a co-author, Michael Gottfredson. right? And this work gets published, like, I think early 90s, I would say, somewhere around there. The other work is like 10, 15 years earlier, right? The social bond stuff, right? And as I said earlier, it's quite different, right? Let me stop here. All right, sorry. I'm trying not to have many interruptions, and but this is the nature of my house, right? It's 8-year-old, 10-year-old, friends from the neighborhood coming over, and I can tell my kids to shut the door so you won't interrupt my video, but they forget like 5 minutes later, right? So I went and shut the doors, and I reminded them that I'm shooting a video, and that will probably work for about 5 minutes when I might come back in here, right? But I don't know if it was distracting you, but it's really distracting me. I was hearing all this noise and stuff in there, my son playing. So yeah, these are the challenges of working from home, right? I had started talking about Travis Hershey and Michael Galbraith's self-control theory, right? One of the things that makes this theory different is it really looks at a characteristic of the individual, right? And that's self-control, right? The other one was like about relationships external to the individual, right? Like relationships with teachers and parents and stuff like that, right? It was Hershey's social bond theory. Of course, Samson Law was like, relationships with employers and spouses and the military and stuff like that. This one is more like about the individual, right? For better or for worse, right? And they argue, and it's a pretty bold claim, really, that there's only one thing that matters when we're trying to explain crime. Does the individual have self-control or not? Do they have high self-control or low self-control, right? And the way that you instill, and he does talk about it, you instill self-control in a child is you monitor their behavior, you recognize their misbehavior, and you correct that misbehavior. And if you do that over a long period of time when the child is growing up consistently, right? Supervise them when they make mistakes. You recognize that that's a mistake and you correct that mistake. If you do that, you will instill self-control in that individual, right? But if you fail to do any of those three things, right? And there's lots of ways you can fail to do those things, right? If you don't monitor those kids, right? When I was growing up, there was this thing called latchkey kids. Moms and dads went to work after the 60s, right? And that meant that there was no mom at home watching us, right? And me and a lot of my friends, right? My mom was home, right? But I'd go to my friend's house where they were not home, and we'd do whatever we wanted till like 5:30 or 6 when their parents got home, right? And then we would, behave ourselves, right? And, sometimes that meant, minor acts of juvenile delinquency and stuff like that, right? So that's one way you can fail to monitor your kids. You're just busy working, right? It also could be, and I used to work at DHR, and I investigated abuse and neglect and stuff like that. If people have substance abuse problems, like mom and dad are alcoholics or crack addicts or any type of gambling addiction and stuff like that, they're usually not monitoring their kids. And even if they are monitoring their kids, they might not recognize inappropriate behavior, right? they might be using the drugs with them, right? Or drinking with them or something like that, right? Yeah. And as a result, they don't always correct that misbehavior, right? So you can see, not all families are good, loving families that, monitor, recognize misbehavior, and correct that misbehavior on a routine basis, right? Lots of things can go wrong. All right, and when those things go wrong, then the kid does not get high self, is not instilled with self-control. That makes them impulsive. That makes them short-sighted, right? It makes them want immediate gratification, right? And kids like that, with those characteristics, are going to commit acts of juvenile delinquency. When they're longer, they're going to commit adult crime, right? Yeah. That's self-control. That's a fairly simple theory. I mean, here's the first way it's really simple. There's only one thing that matters, right? They actually called it the general theory of crime. The general theory of crime. Like, you don't need any other ones after this, right? I disagree with that, right? It's not that good of a theory that nothing else matters, right? It was a wildly popular theory throughout the 90s and early 2000s, right? And, it's kind of played out. It's not as popular now, but, a lot of people really like it. You might really like it, right? It was, it's an attractive theory, and here's why I think it's attractive. It provides a really simple explanation for very complicated behavior, right? And, we like simple explanations, right? But here's the problem with simple explanations. When we're attempting to explain something like crime and delinquency across all people in society, it's not simple. It's complicated, right? Simple explanations cannot capture the complexity of the world. And that's the problem with theory, I think, right? That's really, I think that's the problem with the theory. It's also why a lot of people really like it, right? Because they're like, a lot of students, they'll learn this one. They're like, oh, this is great. It explains everything. It attempts to explain everything, right? I'm not sure it does, right? There are a lot of other things, and that's why we're going to learn a lot of other theories, and that's why, Travis Hershey and Gottfredson had convinced everyone in this field that their theory is the only one we needed. Then when I taught a class thinking about crime, we would only talk about them. But I'm not going to do that, because there's lots of other great theories, many of them better than this, right? Yeah. Now, here's some of the policy implications of this. And this is also something that, remember when we talked about sentiment relevance? And, theories don't live and die just based upon evidence. There's also the sentiment relevance, right? This kind of visceral reaction, right? And a lot of the policy implications of this theory, I just can't. I just don't agree with it. I don't like it. And here's, I said this was popular in the 90s, right? In the early 2000s. And that was an era where we were really tough on crime. It became popular for people to say, once a criminal, always a criminal. And if you believe that, and a lot of people did, right, including politicians, judges, police officers, then when you catch someone committing crime early in their lives, you should try to put them away forever, because once a criminal, always a criminal, right? Now, I don't believe that that is true, right? In fact, I think a lot of Sampson and Lobb's research shows that once you're a criminal, well, you can't get married, you can't get a job, you can reform yourself, right? And those relationships, and you can turn your life around. And that's why we shouldn't give people 30, 40 years sentences for, a lot of crimes, right? Yeah. For example, shouldn't give people 20 and 30 sentences for drugs. I certainly don't think that, right? Because I don't believe once a drug addict, always a drug addict, right? I've seen too many people use drugs early in their life and stop. And a lot of that was they got married, they got a good job, they grew up, and stuff like that. Now, some of those people relapse from time to time, right? But some of them go on and maintain long periods of sobriety. And if they were, lock them up, throw away the key, then, it's unnecessary. It's expensive. It's harmful to those people's lives and their loved ones' lives. And we shouldn't do unnecessary harm to people, right? And I think a lot of unnecessary harm was done to people and children, delinquents, right? Juvenile delinquents. And a lot of it was justified through self-control, because it was argued that, like, either your kids, your parents monitor your behavior and they instill self-control in you, or they don't. And this is the kind of weird thing about this theory. They believe after about the age of 12, whatever level of self-control you have or you don't have, it's going to stay that way for the rest of your life, right? I just disagree with that totally, right? Hasn't been my experience, hasn't been the experiences of people